The wind cut through Marla Greaves like a rusty blade. She pulled her torn shawl tighter, though it did little against the December cold seeping through the gaps in the mail station's wooden walls. Outside, the stagecoach that had brought her this far was already disappearing into the white haze of falling snow, its driver having left her here like unwanted cargo. "Ma'am said you're short on fare," the station boy had told her an hour ago. Not unkindly, but with the practiced indifference of someone who'd seen too many desperate souls pass through. "Driver won't take you no further without payment." Marla hadn't argued. What good would it do? The $3 sewn into her petticoat had gotten her from Missouri to this forgotten corner of South Dakota, and that was more distance than most folks in her situation managed. She'd known the money would run out eventually. She just hadn't expected it to happen here, at a mail station so small it didn't even merit a proper name on the map. Now she sat on a broken crate beside a crooked lamppost, her arms wrapped around a canvas bag that held everything she owned in this world: 2 pieces of hardtack, a tin cup with a cracked handle, a small sewing kit, and a handkerchief embroidered with the letter M, the last gift from her mother before the consumption took her. The station consisted of 3 buildings: the main office where mail changed hands, a stable for fresh horses, and what passed for a boarding house, though boarding was a generous term for the moldy straw mattresses they rented by the night. Marla had already asked about work in exchange for shelter. The station manager, a woman with steel-gray hair and harder eyes, had looked her up and down like she was measuring cloth. "We don't need help," the woman had said, "and even if we did, I run a respectable establishment. Don't take in strays." Strays, as if Marla were some mangy dog begging for scraps, though perhaps that wasn't far from the truth. She'd been traveling for 3 weeks now, each day taking her further from everything she'd known and closer to. What she didn't even have a destination anymore, just a vague hope that somewhere in this vast territory there might be a place where her past didn't matter. A boy appeared from behind the stable, maybe 10 years old, with sandy hair and clothes patched so many times the original fabric was anybody's guess. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with the frank curiosity of frontier children who hadn't yet learned to politely ignore human misery. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. Marla considered lying, spinning some tale about a husband or brother due any moment. But she was tired of lies, tired of pretending. "I'm waiting for kindness," she said quietly. "If such a thing still exists." The boy scrunched his nose. "Ma says kindness is for folks who can afford it." "Your ma sounds like a practical woman." "She runs the boarding house, says she's seen enough sob stories to paper the walls." He kicked at a frozen clod of dirt. "You got a sob story?" "Everyone's got one out here," Marla replied. "Mine's no better or worse than most." The boy seemed to consider this. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out half a biscuit, lint-covered but still food. "Save this from breakfast. You can have it if you want." Marla's throat tightened. She took the biscuit carefully, as if it were made of gold. "What's your name?" "Samuel. Sam." "Thank you, Sam. I'm Marla." "Like in the Bible?" "Something like that." Sam shrugged and wandered off, leaving Marla alone again. She ate the biscuit slowly, savoring each dusty crumb. The snow was falling harder now, transforming the ugly little station into something almost pretty. If she closed her eyes, she could almost pretend she was somewhere else, back in Missouri maybe, before everything went wrong. But closing her eyes was dangerous. That's when the memories came rushing back: her father's debts, the men who came to collect, the choices that weren't really choices at all, the work she'd done in Kansas City to keep food on the table, in establishments that would make the station manager's respectable boarding house look like a palace, the night she'd finally saved enough to run, knowing that staying meant eventually ending up in a pine box behind May's social club. Another girl who'd gotten too old or too sick to earn her keep. Miss. Marla opened her eyes. A different woman stood before her now, elderly and bent. Wrapped in so many layers, she looked like a walking quilt pile. This was Agnes Murphy, who sold eggs when her chickens cooperated and mended clothes when they didn't. "Saw you sitting here," Agnes said. "Temperature's dropping fierce. You'll freeze solid before morning." "I'll manage," Agnes snorted. "Pride's a cold bedfellow. Girl, there's a church 2 miles east. Father Miguel could help." "I tried the church," Marla admitted. "They said their charity funds were spoken for." Agnes's weathered face creased with understanding. "Heard you came in on Crenshaw's stage. That man's got a mouth bigger than his horse's backsides. Probably told half the territory about picking up a woman from Kansas City." So that was it. Her reputation had traveled faster than she had. Marla pulled her shawl up to cover more of her face, though she knew it was useless. In towns this small, gossip moved like wildfire. "There's another option," Agnes said slowly, as if weighing each word. "Man named Shaw's got a place up in the foothills. Calder Shaw. Lost his wife 3 winters back, raising a boy on his own. He don't come to town much, but when he does, he trades fair and keeps his word. Might be he could use help around the place." "Why would he help me?" "Can't say he would, but Calder, he don't judge folks the way others do. Keeps to himself mostly. Some say it's 'cause he's proud. I say it's 'cause he's tired of people's foolishness." Agnes adjusted her shawls. "Course, approaching a widower for work. Folks might talk." "Folks are already talking." "True enough." Agnes pointed north. "His place is 8 miles up the mountain road. Big oak with a lightning scar marks the turn. If you start walking now, might make it before full dark. 8 miles. In the snow. With the night coming on, it was foolish. Dangerous even. But staying here meant freezing to death slowly instead of quickly. And at least walking would keep her blood moving." "Thank you," Marla said. Agnes was already shuffling away. "Don't thank me yet, girl. Calder Shaw might send you packing just like everyone else. But at least you'll have tried." Marla stood, her joints protesting after hours of sitting in the cold. Her boots had holes in 3 places, and she'd stuffed them with newspaper that was now damp and useless. 8 miles. She'd walked further on worse days, though not through snow and not up a mountain. She picked up her canvas bag and took one last look at the mail station. Through the window of the main office, she could see the station manager counting money, warm and comfortable beside a pot-bellied stove. The woman glanced up, caught Marla's eye, and deliberately turned away. "Waiting for kindness," Marla murmured to herself, remembering her words to young Sam. Well, kindness wasn't coming to her. If it existed at all in this hard country, she'd have to walk through hell's own weather to find it. She turned north and began walking, her worn boots crunching through fresh snow. Behind her, the lights of the station grew smaller and smaller, until they were just pinpricks in the gathering darkness. Ahead lay nothing but white and cold, and the vague hope that somewhere up that mountain road lived a man who might see her as something more than a stray. The wind howled louder as she climbed, and Marla pulled her mother's handkerchief from her bag, holding it tight in her fist. The embroidered M was barely visible in the fading light, but she knew it was there. M for Marla, M for Missouri, M for all the mistakes that had led her here, to this lonely road where each step might be her last. But still she walked, because walking was all she had left, and somewhere beyond the cold and snow and judgment of small-town folks, there had to be something better. There had to be. The first stars were appearing when she finally saw it, a giant oak tree split nearly in half by some long-ago storm, its scarred trunk pointing like a finger toward a narrow path that led higher into the hills. Calder Shaw's road. Marla turned onto the path, not knowing that this moment, this choice to keep walking when everything in her screamed to give up, would change not just her life, but the lives of a silent man and his motherless boy. She only knew that her feet hurt. Her hands were numb. And somewhere at the end of this path was either salvation or just another closed door. Time would tell which. Calder Shaw had learned to read weather the way other men read books, the way the clouds bunched up against the mountain peaks, the particular stillness in the air before a hard snow, the restless stamping of horses in the barn. All these things spoke to him clearer than most human conversation ever had. So when he stepped out of his cabin that December evening to check on the animals, he knew the storm coming in would be a bad one. "Evan," he called to his son, who was splitting kindling by the woodshed. "Better bring in extra wood. This blow's fixing to last a while." The boy nodded, not wasting words. He was his father's son in that way, had been even before his mother passed. Martha used to joke that between the two of them, she had to talk enough for 3 people just to keep the house from falling into complete silence. Calder pushed the memory away, focusing instead on practical matters. The horses were secure. The chicken coop reinforced against foxes and weather alike. They had flour, salt pork, dried beans, enough to last 2 weeks if need be. Living this far from town meant always being prepared for isolation. He was checking the leather hinges on the barn door when he heard it, or thought he did, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the creaking trees. He stood still, listening. There it was again, footsteps. But who would be fool enough to climb the mountain road with a storm bearing down? Calder reached for the rifle he always kept nearby, then thought better of it. In 3 years since Martha's death, the only visitors to their homestead had been the occasional trapper or the tax assessor, neither worth shooting at. Still, he kept his hand near his hip where a hunting knife rested in its worn sheath. The figure that emerged from the snow-swirled darkness looked more ghost than human. A woman, though he had to look twice to be sure. So bundled was she in wet rags and a shawl that might once have been blue, she stumbled on the path, caught herself, stumbled again. When she finally looked up and saw him standing there, she stopped. They regarded each other across 20 feet of frozen ground. Calder saw hollow cheeks, eyes too big for the face, hands clutched around a canvas bag like it held the secrets of the universe. But he also saw something else, a straightness to her spine despite exhaustion, a lift to her chin that suggested pride hadn't been completely beaten out of her yet.
Mr. Shaw?"
Her voice was hoarse, barely carrying over the wind. He nodded once. "My name is Marla Greaves. I've come from the mail station. Mrs. Murphy, Agnes Murphy, she said you might have work." Calder didn't answer immediately. He was trying to place her accent, educated but with rough edges. Eastern originally, maybe, but seasoned by frontier towns. Her clothes told their own story. The dress had once been quality, the kind Martha would have admired in a shop window. But now it was patched with mismatched fabric and hem-heavy with frozen mud. "Storm's coming," he said finally. "Bad one." She swayed slightly. "I know. I'm sorry. I wouldn't have come, but—" She stopped, seeming to realize that explanations required energy she didn't have. Evan had come around the woodshed, arms full of split pine. The boy stopped when he saw the stranger, looking to his father for cues. Calder could feel his son's wariness, same as his own. They'd built a careful life here, just the two of them. Routines that worked, silences that were comfortable, a way of grieving that didn't require words. But he also thought of Martha, who would have had this woman inside by now, wrapped in quilts with hot tea brewing. Martha, who once told him that kindness cost nothing but meant everything. Martha, whose absence still echoed through every room of their home like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. "You walked from the station?" he asked. "In this weather?" "Yes." "That's 8 miles, uphill." "Yes." He studied her boots, or what was left of them. The newspaper stuffing was visible through splits in the leather. Her feet had to be near frozen. 8 miles. Christ.
"Pa."
Evan's voice was uncertain. Calder made his decision. Not from kindness, exactly. He wasn't sure he had much of that left. More from a practical understanding that turning her away now would make him responsible for whatever happened to her on the way back down. And he'd carried enough guilt these past 3 years. "Get inside," he told both of them. Evan, stoke the fire. Ma'am, you can sit by the stove. The woman, Marla, took a step and nearly fell. Without thinking, Calder moved forward and caught her elbow. She weighed next to nothing, like a bird built of wire and cloth. This close, he could smell the road on her. Sweat and fear, and that particular scent of someone who'd been running from something for too long. "Thank you," she whispered. He released her arm as soon as she was steady. "Come on." The cabin was modest but solid. 2 rooms plus a loft where Evan slept. Calder had built it with his own hands the year before Evan was born, choosing each log for straightness, chinking every gap against the mountain winters. Martha had made it a home with curtains and rag rugs and flowers in tin cans, but those touches had faded like everything else about her presence. Now it was just a place where 2 people ate and slept and did their chores. Functional as a good axe handle and about as warm. Marla sank into the chair Evan pulled near the stove, and Calder saw her fight not to cry from the pain as heat hit her frozen extremities. He knew that pain like being stabbed with 1,000 needles as blood started flowing again. "Evan, get the kettle on," he said, "and bring down one of your ma's." He stopped. "Bring down a dry dress from the trunk." The boy hesitated, and Calder saw the struggle in his face. The trunk held Martha's things, carefully folded and stored with lavender to keep the moths away. Neither of them had opened it since the day they'd put her clothes away. "Go on," Calder said gently. While Evan climbed to the loft, Calder busied himself pulling off Marla's boots. They came apart in his hands, the frozen newspaper falling out in clumps. Her feet were white as porcelain, with angry red spots that meant the beginning of frostbite. "This'll hurt," he warned, then began rubbing circulation back into them with careful efficiency. She bit her lip but didn't cry out. "Agnes Murphy," he said, needing to fill the silence with something other than her pain. "She send many folks up here." "I don't think so." Marla's teeth chattered. "She said you trade fair and keep your word." "That all she said?" "She said you don't judge people the way others do." Calder focused on her feet. One of her toes had an old break that hadn't healed right, giving it a crooked angle. There were calluses that spoke of long hours standing. Scars that looked like they came from too tight shoes worn too long. Working feet. Survivor's feet. Evan returned with one of Martha's plain work dresses, brown wool with wooden buttons. He held it like it might break, and something in Calder's chest tightened at the sight. "There's a privacy screen in the corner." Calder told Marla, "Get out of those wet things before you catch your death." She stood carefully, testing her feet. "Mr. Shaw, I need to be clear about something. I came here looking for honest work. Nothing else. I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals. I'm not afraid of hard labor." "Didn't say you were." "And I'm not—" She paused, choosing words. "I'm not looking for charity. If you have no work, I'll leave come morning." "In what shoes?" Evan asked, looking at the destroyed boots. Marla had no answer for that. Calder stood, suddenly feeling every one of his 41 years. "Change your clothes. We'll have supper soon. Rest we can figure out after." Behind the screen, he could hear the rustle of wet fabric being peeled away. He and Evan moved around the kitchen with practiced coordination, the boy setting out plates while Calder ladled rabbit stew from the pot that had been simmering all day. It wasn't much, but it was hot and filling. When Marla emerged, Martha's dress hung loose on her thinner frame. She'd wrung out her hair and tied it back with what looked like a piece of twine from her bag. The transformation was striking, from half-dead traveler to a woman who might have been anyone's neighbor. Anyone's. He stopped that thought before it could form. They ate in near silence. Just the scrape of spoons on tin plates and the pop of wood in the stove. Calder noticed she ate slowly, deliberately, the way people did when they'd been hungry long enough to respect food. Evan watched her from under his sandy bangs, curious but cautious. "Your boy's got your eyes," she said finally. "He's got his mother's sense." Calder replied, Better trade than ice. Ma could sing. Evan offered unexpectedly. Knew all the hymns and some that weren't hymns too. She said music made the work lighter. It was the most the boy had said about Martha in months. Calder saw Marla note this, saw her calculate whether to pursue it or let it be. She chose silence, which raised his opinion of her judgment. After supper, the question hung in the air unasked. Where would she sleep? The cabin had only the 2 bedrooms, outside. The storm had arrived in earnest. Wind howling like wolves and snow hitting the windows hard enough to rattle them. There's the woodshed, Calder said finally. Got a cot I use during calving season. Evan can help me move it near the kitchen stove. You'll be warm enough. That's more than fair. Thank you. They worked together to arrange the space. The cot pulled close to the heat, a pile of quilts that smelled of cedar, a curtain rigged from rope and an old sheet to give her privacy. It wasn't much, but it was worlds better than freezing to death on the mountain road. As Calder added another log to the fire, Marla spoke quietly. Mr. Shaw, that boy needs someone gentle in his life. I could see it at supper, the way he watches everything, stores it all up inside. I've known children like that. Calder's hand stilled on the stove handle. You got children? No, but I've been around them. I know what it looks like when they're carrying weight that isn't theirs to carry. He wanted to tell her to mind her own business, that she didn't know anything about him or Evan or the weight they carried, but something in her tone, not pity, just recognition, kept him quiet. Get some sleep, he said instead. We rise early here. She nodded, already turning to her makeshift room. Mr. Shaw, what you did tonight, most men wouldn't have. Most men didn't have Martha for a wife, he said without thinking, then retreated to his own room before she could respond. But later, lying in the dark, listening to the storm rage outside, Calder found himself thinking about those destroyed boots, the straight spine despite exhaustion, the way she'd said honest work like it was a prayer. He didn't know her story, didn't particularly want to, but he knew what it looked like when someone was at the end of their rope. And Marla Greaves had passed that point somewhere on the 8-mile climb to his door. Come morning, he'd have to make a decision. Send her back to town with the tax assessor's old boots and whatever money his conscience demanded. Or what, keep her here? A strange woman in a house with no woman's presence for 3 years. The town would talk. Hell, they already talked about him and Evan, the hermit widower and his too quiet son. But as sleep finally came, Calder found himself thinking not of town gossip but of Evan at supper, talking about his mother's songs. First time in months the boy had volunteered a memory instead of hoarding them like winter provisions. Maybe that was worth something. Maybe that was worth everything. Outside, the storm howled on, but inside the cabin 3 souls slept, brought together by chance or providence or simple human need, and in the morning, everything would change. Morning came harsh and bright, the storm having blown itself out sometime before dawn. Calder woke as he always did, at that gray hour when the sky just started to separate itself from the mountain ridges. For a moment, lying in his cold bed, he'd forgotten about the woman sleeping by his kitchen stove. Then he heard a sound that didn't belong, the quiet splash of water being poured into a basin. He dressed quickly and emerged to find Marla already up, her hair pinned back severely, Martha's brown dress looking somehow neater than it had the night before. She'd found his sewing kit and taken in the worst of the loose seams. The coffee pot was on the stove, and she was mixing biscuit dough in the wooden bowl Martha had used for the same purpose. Morning, she said without turning around. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to earn my keep. How long you been up? Hour, maybe more. I don't sleep well in new places. Calder grunted, unsure how to respond. Martha had been the same way their first months in the cabin, up before dawn to prove her worth, as if he'd married her for her biscuit-making abilities. The memory sat uncomfortable in his chest. Coffee's about ready, Marla continued. Found your stores. Hope that was all right. You're low on flour. I could stretch it better with a bit of cornmeal if you've got any. In the root cellar. He sat at the table, watching her work. Her movements were efficient, practiced. You cooked for a large household before. Sometimes. She didn't elaborate. Evan appeared at the top of the loft ladder, hair sticking every direction. He saw Marla and froze, like he'd forgotten she existed overnight. "Morning, Evan," she said gently. "Breakfast will be ready soon." The boy looked to his father, who nodded. Only then did he climb down, heading outside to the privy without a word. "He doesn't talk much," Marla observed. "Talks when he's got something to say. Must get that from his father." Despite himself, Calder felt his mouth twitch, almost a smile. His mother used to say God gave her a husband and son who saved all their words up special, so they'd really count when they used them. Marla set a cup of coffee in front of him. It was strong, the way he liked it. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was—" They fell into silence until Evan returned, hands and face washed with snow. The three of them ate biscuits with the last of the preserves, a strange echo of family breakfast that made Calder's skin itch with its wrongness, or maybe its rightness. He couldn't tell anymore. After the meal, as Evan cleared plates, Calder faced what he'd been avoiding. "About your situation here." Marla's hands stilled in washing the dishes. "Yes. I can't pay much. Room, board, and $2 a week. It's honest work. Cooking, cleaning, mending. Help with the garden come spring. Nothing else." "Nothing else," she agreed firmly. "Town will talk. They always do. Single woman, widowed man. You need to know that going in." "Mr. Shaw, the town was already talking about me before I climbed your mountain. At least here I'll be earning my reputation honestly." He studied her profile as she worked. In daylight, he could see things the darkness had hidden. A small scar on her temple, the way she favored her left shoulder, hands that had known harder work than housekeeping. "What made Agnes Murphy think I'd take you in?" She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, maybe she knew something about needing second chances, or third ones, or however many it takes until one finally sticks. "And you, what are you running from?" "Does it matter? We're all running from something out here. The difference is whether we're running to something better or just running." Fair enough, Calder thought. Lord knew he had his own ghosts. 3-month trial, he said. "Either of us can end it with a week's notice. You cross any lines, you're gone. You take anything that isn't yours, you're gone. You bring trouble to my door." "I'm gone. I understand." "And the boy?" He paused, choosing words carefully. "The boy's been through enough. You be gentle with him, but don't coddle, don't try to mother him. He had a mother." "I wouldn't presume." Calder stood, suddenly needing distance from this conversation that felt too much like negotiation and too little like the simple hiring of help. "I've got work in the barn. Evan'll show you where things are." But at the door, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Shaw, thank you. I know what this costs you." He didn't turn around. "You don't know anything about me, Miss Greaves." "Mrs. Greaves," she corrected quietly. "And you're right. I don't, but I know what it looks like when someone does something that goes against their grain because it's the right thing. My husband was like that, always choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, right up until it killed him." Calder did turn then. She was standing by the stove, hands wrapped in her apron, looking smaller than she had the night before, but somehow stronger too. "The war," he asked. "After, tried to stop some men from burning out a freedman's farm, said it wasn't Christian, what they were planning." She shrugged. "They disagreed." "I'm sorry. It was 8 years ago. I've been sorry so long I've forgotten what it feels like not to be." They looked at each other across the kitchen. Two people who'd learned that life could take everything you valued in a heartbeat and leave you to figure out how to keep breathing anyway. The boy doesn't know much about his mother's passing. Calder said abruptly, "She went quick. Fever. There wasn't time for goodbyes or last words or any of the things folks think they'll get. She was here, and then she wasn't. And we've been trying to make sense of that ever since. Some things don't make sense. They just are. That's what I tell myself. Doesn't help much." "No," Marla agreed. "It doesn't." Calder left then, escaping to the familiar world of animals and tools and work that had clear beginnings and endings. But all morning, as he repaired harnesses and checked the livestock, he found himself aware of the house in a way he hadn't been for years. Smoke from the chimney meant someone was keeping the fire going. The sound of Evan's voice, actually talking, drifted from the kitchen window. When he came in for the noon meal, he found his son at the table with a slate, working on letters while Marla kneaded bread dough. "She knows words," Evan announced. "Big ones. Told me what perseverance means." "That's so. Means keeping on when you want to quit, like when the plow horse gets stuck but pulls anyway." "Good word," Calder agreed, hanging his coat. The kitchen smelled of yeast and coffee and something else, lye soap. She'd been scrubbing. "Also told me melancholy," Evan continued. "That's when you're sad, but it's a thinking kind of sad, not a crying kind." Calder glanced at Marla, who kept her eyes on her dough. "You had schooling." "My father was a minister, believed in education for all his children, even the girls, especially the girls. Actually, said ignorance was the devil's favorite tool." "Smart man." "He was, until he started believing his own sermons about helping the less fortunate. Gave away everything we had to folks he thought needed it more. Died owing money to half the county and praising God with his last breath." "And your mother?" "Died bringing my youngest brother into the world. He lived 3 days." She shaped the dough with practiced motions. "That was when I learned that God's plan and what we want aren't always the same thing." Evan had stopped writing, absorbing this talk of death with the quiet attention frontier children learned early. Death was as common as sunrise out here, and pretending otherwise did nobody any favors. "My ma's buried under the big pine," the boy offered. "Pa made her a stone with her name and dates. Sometimes I put flowers there." "That's good," Marla said simply. "The remembering matters." After lunch, Calder returned to work, but the conversation nagged at him. A minister's daughter who'd married a man killed for defending freedmen, who'd somehow ended up in Kansas doing work that left scars and calluses and that particular wariness around the eyes. The pieces didn't quite fit, but then again, nobody's story ever did out here. Late afternoon brought the sound of horses on the road. Calder looked up from splitting wood to see Tom Harrison, the tax assessor, riding up with his assistant. Not unexpected. Tom always made his rounds before the deep winter set in. "Calder," Tom greeted, dismounting. His eyes went immediately to the kitchen window where movement was visible. "Heard you had company." "News travels fast. Jacob at the mail station said a woman headed up your way in the storm. Wanted to make sure she arrived safe." Tom's tone was carefully neutral, but his assistant, a ferrety young man named Wilkins, was already craning his neck to get a better look at the house. "She arrived," Calder said shortly. "Hired her on for housekeeping." "That's so, well, that's practical. Boy needs a woman's influence, I suppose." Calder heard what wasn't being said. Within 2 days, everyone in the valley would know about his housekeeper, and speculation would run wild. Some would assume the worst immediately. Others would wait and watch, ready to pounce on any sign of impropriety. "Are you coming in for coffee?" Calder asked, because not offering would be noted and commented on just as much as anything else. Inside, Marla had clearly seen them coming. She'd put on a clean apron and pulled her hair back even more severely. When introduced, she bobbed her head politely but didn't smile or simper or do any of the things that might have been misinterpreted.
Mrs. Greaves,
she said firmly when Tom used Miss. Widow, Tom asked with interest that wasn't entirely professional. 8 years now. From back east. Originally, most recently from Kansas. Calder saw Tom file this information away for later distribution. By evening, half the town would know her name, her status, and her origin. By week's end, someone would probably have figured out what she'd been doing in Kansas. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he didn't much care. After the men left, trailing gossip like smoke, Marla sat down heavily at the table.
"It starts now,"
she said.
"The watching, the whispers. Maybe I should—"
3-month trial. Calder interrupted. We agreed, unless you're planning to break your word first day on the job. She looked up at him, something flickering in her eyes that might have been gratitude or might have been surprise that anyone still expected her to keep her word. No, Mr. Shaw. I'll stay the term. Good. Now, about that cornmeal from the root cellar. Evan can show you where. That night, after supper. Calder sat by the fire cleaning his rifle while Evan practiced his letters and Marla mended one of the boys' torn shirts. The silence was different than usual, fuller somehow, but not unpleasant. Like the house itself was adjusting to having 3 heartbeats instead of 2. Pa, Evan said suddenly. Mrs. Greaves knows the song about the fox and the goose, the one Ma used to sing. Calder's hand stilled on the rifle. That's so. She said she'd teach it to me if that's all right, so I can remember it proper. Calder looked across at Marla, who was watching him carefully over her sewing. Your mother would have wanted you to know it proper, he said finally. The smile Evan gave him was worth any amount of town gossip. And when Marla began to hum softly while she sewed, not the fox song, just a gentle melody, Calder found he didn't mind that either. Change, he reflected, came whether you invited it or not. The trick was recognizing when it might be the kind of change that helped rather than hurt. Looking at his son's face, more animated than he'd seen it in months, Calder thought maybe this particular change might be the helpful kind. Time would tell. Time always did. But for now, there was coffee and firelight and the small sounds of life being lived. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The evening had settled deep and quiet, with only the pop of pine logs in the stove breaking the silence. Evan had gone to bed an hour ago, climbing the ladder to his loft with less reluctance than usual. Maybe it was the warm meal sitting well in his belly, or the promise of learning his mother's song properly. Maybe it was simply having another soul in the house who didn't carry grief like a millstone. Calder sat at the table, ostensibly working on accounts, but mostly watching Marla arrange her makeshift quarters for the night. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to take up much space, folding her few possessions just so, arranging the thin blanket on the cot he'd pulled from the shed. That cot's seen better days, he said finally. There's extra quilts in the trunk if you need them. This is fine. She tested the stretched canvas, which sagged ominously in the middle. I've slept on worse. No doubt, but you're not sleeping on worse now. You're sleeping in my house, and I'll not have you freezing for the sake of pride. She paused, hands stilling on the blanket. Your house, yes, I suppose I should be clear about something. Mr. Shaw. Here it comes, Calder thought. The negotiation, the suggestion, the careful dance around what everyone in town would assume anyway. He'd been waiting for it since Tom Harrison left, spreading news like seeds on the wind. But Marla surprised him. She moved to stand near the stove, far enough away that the table stood between them like a barrier, or a promise. If I sleep here, she said quietly, meeting his eyes straight on, I wake yours. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Not a proposition. Exactly, more like a statement of intent, or maybe a test of his. Calder studied her face in the lamplight. The hollowness had filled out just slightly with 2 good meals, but the wariness remained. Whatever had driven her to walk 8 miles through a blizzard had left marks deeper than the scar on her temple. He could send her away now, give her the tax assessor's old boots and whatever money conscience demanded. It would be the easier path, the one that wouldn't set tongues wagging from here to Rosewood, the one that wouldn't disturb the careful balance he and Evan had built from the ruins of their loss. But he thought of Evan's face at supper, animated in a way it hadn't been for months. He thought of the kitchen smelling like bread again. He thought of Martha. Who would have taken one look at those destroyed boots and made up the cot herself? "All right," he said simply, and nodded once. Something shifted in Marla's face. Relief, maybe, or surprise that negotiations could be that simple. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking younger than she probably was. "I don't know your rules," she said. "What you expect, what you won't tolerate, I need to know the boundaries so I don't cross them." Calder leaned back in his chair. "Simple enough. You cook, you clean, you help with what needs helping. You treat the boy fair but don't try to replace what he's lost. You keep your troubles to yourself unless they're likely to land on my doorstep. You want to go to town, you go, though I'd appreciate knowing when. Sunday mornings are your own if you're inclined toward church, though we don't attend anymore. And us, how do we?" "We don't," he said firmly. "You work here, you sleep here, but we're not anything, not friends, not family, not whatever story the town wants to tell, just 2 people sharing a roof because it makes practical sense. That's a cold way to live. It's a clear way to live. Clear is better than complicated." Marla moved to her cot, testing it again. "What about Evan? What do I tell him about why I'm here?" "The truth. You needed work. I needed help. Nothing more to it than that. Children see things adults pretend aren't there. Then he'll see what's true, that you're here to work, nothing else." She sat on the edge of the cot, which creaked alarmingly. "You know, Mr. Shaw, for someone who claims to want simplicity, you're making this awfully complicated." Despite himself, Calder felt a smile tug at his mouth. "How's that? All these rules and boundaries and declarations, seems to me if we just go about our business and treat each other decent, the rest sorts itself out." "That simple, is it?" "Most things are, when you let them be." He stood, suddenly tired. It had been a long day, and tomorrow would be longer. "Maybe so. Get some rest. Mrs. Greaves. Morning comes early on a working farm." Mr. Shaw," she called as he headed for his room. "That thing I said about sleeping here and waking yours, I meant it. I'm not looking for anything beyond what you offered. Just wanted that clear between us." "It's clear." But lying in his bed, staring at the ceiling, Calder found it wasn't clear at all. Oh, the words were clear enough. The boundaries were set, the rules established. But there was something about the way she'd said it, "I wake yours," that suggested ownership without possession, belonging without intrusion. Martha would have understood it instantly. She'd had a way of cutting through his tendency to complicate simple things. "You think too much," she'd tell him when he'd worry over decisions other men made without blinking. "Sometimes you just have to trust that things will work out as they're meant to." Easy for her to say. She'd been the one with faith enough for both of them. All Calder had now was habit and stubbornness and a boy who needed raising. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe it had to be. He could hear movement from the kitchen, the careful sounds of someone trying to settle quietly in an unfamiliar place. The cot creaked. Footsteps padded to the stove to add wood. The damper adjusted with a soft clang. Then, so faint, he almost missed it. Humming. Not a song exactly, just a gentle melody that seemed to rise from someplace deep. It was the sound of someone self-soothing, the way a body rocks itself to sleep or a hand reaches for something familiar in the dark. Calder closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. It had been 3 years since there'd been music in this house. 3 years of silence broken only by necessary words and the sounds of daily survival. He'd thought he preferred it that way, thought the quiet was a kind of honor to Martha's memory. But maybe memory wasn't served by silence. Maybe it was served by life continuing, by songs being sung and bread being baked and boys learning to smile again. Through the thin walls, the humming continued. He thought he recognized the tune, something about green valleys and clear streams, a song about finding home, or losing it, or maybe both. Martha would have known all the words. Calder turned over and pulled the quilt up higher. Tomorrow there would be chores and challenges and probably the first of many visits from curious neighbors. There would be questions to deflect and assumptions to correct, and the slow work of teaching the valley that whatever they thought was happening in the Shaw house wasn't. But tonight, there was just this: a woman humming softly in his kitchen, his boy sleeping peaceful in the loft, and the strange sense that something broken was slowly, carefully, beginning to mend. He'd told Marla he wasn't looking for complications, but life had a way of ignoring what you were looking for and giving you what you needed instead. And maybe, just maybe, what he and Evan needed was exactly this kind of complication. The humming stopped. The house settled into sleep. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Calder Shaw slept without dreams. Morning would come soon enough, with all its challenges and choices. But for now, in the deep quiet of a mountain night, 3 souls rested under one roof. Not a family, not yet, maybe not ever, but something more than the nothing that had been there before. It was a start. And sometimes, Calder thought as sleep finally took him, a start was all you could ask for. That, and the courage to see where it led. The last thing he heard before darkness claimed him was the wind outside, no longer howling but sighing, as if it too had decided that some storms were meant to bring strangers together rather than tear them apart. In the kitchen, Marla pulled the thin blanket higher and closed her eyes. She'd made her declaration, stated her terms. If I sleep here, I wake yours. Not ownership. Exactly. Not claim or possession or any of the things that had gotten her into trouble before. Just a simple statement of fact that by accepting shelter, she accepted responsibility. By taking space in this house, she became part of its purpose. She'd see how long it lasted. 3 months. He'd said 3 months to prove herself useful, trustworthy, necessary even. 3 months to show that some gambles were worth taking, some strangers worth trusting, some broken things worth mending. It was more time than she'd had in a while, more hope than she'd dared carry. It would have to be enough. For now, it was everything. The first week passed in careful rhythms. Marla rose before dawn, had coffee ready when Calder emerged from his room, and breakfast on the table by the time Evan climbed down from the loft. She spoke when spoken to, moved quietly through her tasks, and retired to her corner each evening without complaint. It was, Calder thought, like living with a particularly efficient ghost. Evan watched her constantly those first days, tracking her movements with the wariness of a half-wild creature. He answered her questions with single words, took the plate she handed him without meeting her eyes, and circled around her in the kitchen like she might suddenly turn dangerous. Marla didn't push. She left small offerings instead. An extra biscuit on his plate, his favorite shirt mended and folded on his bed, the slate cleaned and ready for his lessons. She hummed while she worked, but never sang, as if music itself needed permission in this house of careful silence. On the 8th morning, Calder found Evan at the kitchen table with his slate, struggling over sums while Marla kneaded bread. "Carry the 1, she said without looking up from her dough. "I know," Evan muttered, erasing again. "Do you, because that 7 looks mighty lonely without its friend." The boy glared at his slate, then grudgingly added the carried number. The sum came out right. He looked up at Marla with surprise. "My father taught mathematics before he took to preaching," she said. "Numbers are just another language. Cleaner than most. Actually, Numbers don't lie or pretend to be something they're not. Pa says you went to school. I didn't care for it much, but Father insisted. Said ignorance was a luxury we couldn't afford. Ma couldn't read much, Evan offered quietly. Pa tried to teach her, but she said the letters swam around like fish. She could sign her name, though. Practiced it over and over until it was perfect. It was the longest speech the boy had made in Marla's presence. She kept her hand steady on the dough, not wanting to spook him. Writing your name is important, she agreed. It's saying, I was here, I mattered. Is that why you can write to matter? Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to read the stories in books instead of always wondering what they said. Evan considered this. Could you teach me better than I know? I mean, Pa tries, but your father has other things to tend to, if he's agreeable. I could help with your letters and numbers.
I'll ask him,
Evan said, then added quietly, You're not like I thought you'd be. What did you think I'd be like? He shrugged, suddenly shy again. Don't know. Different. The women in town, when they come calling, they're always... He made a face. Sticky. Like honey cakes. Too sweet. Despite herself, Marla smiled.
I've never been accused of being too sweet.
Good, Evan said firmly, and went back to his sums. When Calder came in for the noon meal, he found them bent over the slate together, Evan's tongue poking out in concentration as he formed letters under Marla's guidance. She knows about apostrophes, Evan announced, and when to use them and when not to. It's not just for ownership. Pa, it's for when letters go missing too. That's so. Calder hung his coat, watching them. Marla had pulled her chair close to the boys, but not too close. Maintaining that careful distance she seemed to calculate with everyone. Can she teach me regular in the afternoons when chores are done? Evan looked hopeful. She says she doesn't mind. Calder glanced at Marla, who kept her eyes on the slate. If Mrs. Greaves has time and inclination, I see no harm in it. The smile Evan gave him was worth any disruption to their routine, and when Marla looked up with quiet gratitude in her eyes, Calder found himself oddly warm despite the kitchen's drafts. That afternoon, while Evan helped in the barn, Marla attacked the house with purposeful energy. She'd been cleaning all week, but this was different, deeper, more thorough. Calder came in for water and found her on her knees, scrubbing the baseboards with lye soap. Those haven't been touched in years, he said. I can tell. She sat back on her heels, pushing hair from her face with the back of her hand. This house has good bones, Mr. Shaw. It just needs some attention. It's just a house. No, she said firmly. It's a home, or it was. Could be again, if you let it. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was overstepping, but there was something in the way she looked around the room, not with pity or judgment, but with a kind of recognition, like she saw not what was missing but what remained. That evening after supper, she brought out a small tin from her belongings. Inside were 3 precious commodities, a needle book, good thread, and a pair of sharp scissors. Evan's jacket is more whole than cloth, she said. Mind if I work on it? Do what you think best. She settled by the lamp and began the careful work of patching. Evan watched from across the table, supposedly working on letters but mostly studying her hands as they moved. Ma had scissors like those, he said eventually, silver ones with a bird on them. These were my mother's, Marla said, not looking up. One of the few things I kept. What happened to the rest? Sold, mostly, lost some, left some behind when leaving was more important than keeping. Why'd you have to leave? Marla's hand stilled for just a moment. Sometimes staying in a place costs more than you can pay. Calder tensed, waiting for his son to push further into territory that wasn't theirs to explore. But Evan just nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Like when the creek floods, the boy said. You gotta get out, even if it means leaving things behind." Exactly like that. They worked in companionable quiet until Evan's head started drooping. Calder sent him to bed, and the boy went without protest. Another small change in the household rhythms. Alone with Marla for the first time since that first night, Calder found himself unaccountably nervous. She kept sewing, apparently untroubled by the silence, but he could feel questions building between them like storm clouds. "The boy's taking to you," he said finally.
He's a good child, cautious, but that's wise out here.
His mother used to say he was born serious, came into the world frowning like he already knew it would disappoint him. Maybe he just knew he'd need to be strong. Calder studied her profile in the lamplight. "You had children?"
No, never had the chance.
"Your husband?" "We were only married 2 years before he died. We thought we had time." She tied off a thread, examined her work. Time's the one thing you can never count on having enough of. "True enough." She folded the jacket, setting it aside. "Mr. Shaw, can I ask you something?" He nodded, wary. "That first night when I showed up half frozen, why did you let me in, really?" Calder considered the question. He could give her the easy answer. Christian charity, basic decency, the boy needing help. All true enough, but there'd been something else, something he'd barely admitted to himself. "You reminded me of someone," he said finally. "Your wife?" "No, myself. The day I came home from the war and found everything changed, standing at the crossroads, trying to decide if going forward was worth the effort." He paused. "You had that look, like you'd reached the end of one story and didn't know if you had strength to start another. And did you find the strength?" "Martha found it for me, grabbed my hand and pulled me into the next chapter whether I was ready or not." His voice roughened. "Always was better at seeing what could be than what was."
She sounds remarkable.
"She was ordinary," Calder corrected. "That's what made her remarkable. She took ordinary things, days, chores, conversations, and made them matter, made them enough." Marla stood, began tidying her sewing supplies. "I should let you rest." "Mrs. Greaves." He waited until she looked at him. "The boy, he's starting to smile again. Haven't seen that in months. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." "I'm not doing anything special." "That's what I mean. Martha always said the special things were the ones that didn't try to be." She considered this, then nodded. "Good night, Mr. Shaw." After she'd settled in her corner, Calder sat by the dying fire, thinking. 8 days she'd been here. 8 days of careful distances and quiet movements. But already the house felt different. Lived in. Like it was remembering how to be a home instead of just a shelter. He thought about that moment when she'd stood by the stove and made her declaration. "If I sleep here, I wake yours." He'd taken it as terms, conditions, boundaries set. But maybe she'd meant something else. Maybe she'd been saying that by accepting shelter. She accepted responsibility for more than just cooking and cleaning. Maybe she'd been saying she'd help them wake from the long sleep of grief they'd fallen into. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. From the kitchen came the soft sound of Marla shifting on the cot, trying to find a position where the canvas didn't sag. Tomorrow he'd see about getting her a proper bed. Nothing fancy, just something that didn't creak like a ship in a storm. It was practical, he told himself. Hard to work properly without decent sleep. But as he banked the fire and headed to his room, Calder knew it was more than that. It was acknowledgement that Marla Greaves was no longer just passing through. She'd made her declaration and kept her word. She slept here. She woke theirs. And maybe, just maybe, they were all the better for it. The first trip to town came 3 weeks after Marla's arrival. Calder had put it off as long as possible, but they needed supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, and a dozen other necessities that even the most self-sufficient homestead couldn't produce. "I'll stay here," Marla said when he announced the trip over breakfast. "Make a list of what you need." "You'll come with us." Calder corrected. Need to get you proper boots. For one thing, can't have you spending winter in those borrowed ones. She'd been wearing Martha's old work boots, stuffed with rags to make them fit. Every time Calder saw them, he remembered those destroyed shoes she'd arrived in, newspaper falling out in frozen chunks. I have no money for boots. Mr. Shaw, you've earned wages, 3 weeks' worth. That's for sending to... She stopped abruptly. To... Never mind, it's not important. But Calder filed the exchange away. Someone, somewhere, was waiting for money from Marla Greaves. Family, maybe. Or debts. Another piece of her puzzle. Though he told himself he wasn't trying to solve it. The ride to town took 2 hours. Evan wedged between them on the wagon seat. Marla had dressed carefully, her traveling dress cleaned and pressed, hair pinned severely under a bonnet she'd refurbished with a bit of ribbon from her sewing basket. She looked respectable, proper even, but Calder knew it wouldn't matter. In towns like Rosewood, reputation arrived faster than the person wearing it. They passed the Sherman farm first, where Mrs. Sherman was hanging wash despite the cold. She straightened when she saw them, shading her eyes for a better look. By the time they reached the Turner place, Mr. Turner was already at his gate, apparently checking his mail, though the post wouldn't come through for days. "Morning, Cal," Turner called, his eyes fixed on Marla. "Heard you had help up at your place." "Morning, Jim." Calder didn't slow the horses. "Ma'am," Turner added, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Marla nodded silently, hands folded in her lap. Evan scooted closer to her, whether in protection or seeking it. Calder couldn't tell. By the time they reached Rosewood proper, it felt like the whole town had turned out to watch their arrival. Women paused in their shopping to whisper behind gloved hands. Men found reasons to loiter outside shops, touching their hat brims with knowing smirks. "Like a parade," Evan muttered. "Hush," Calder said, but he felt it too, the weight of all those eyes, the judgment crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. He pulled up outside Morrison's general store. "We'll start here. Mrs. Greaves needs boots. Evan needs new slate pencils, and we all need supplies." "Inside, Mrs." Morrison greeted them with the kind of bright smile that meant she'd been preparing for this moment since she first heard the gossip. "Why, Calder Shaw, how lovely to see you in town. And this must be your housekeeper." "Mrs. Greaves," Marla said evenly. "Pleased to meet you." "Of course. Mrs. Greaves." Mrs. Morrison's emphasis on the Mrs. suggested deep skepticism. "From Kansas, I hear." "Most recently, yes. And before that, here and there." "How fascinating. You must have such stories." Marla smiled, a small, closed thing that gave away nothing. No more than anyone else who's lived through interesting times. They moved through the store gathering supplies, but Calder could feel the other customers tracking their movements. Mrs. Hartley accidentally appeared wherever they went, always needing something from the same shelf. Young Mrs. Collins made 3 circuits of the store without buying anything, her eyes darting between Marla and Calder like she was reading a scandal sheet. At the boot display, Mr. Morrison himself appeared to help, though his son usually handled footwear. "Something sturdy," Calder said, "for farm work." Morrison's eyes flicked between them. "Of course. And will you be needing separate receipts?" "One receipt is fine," Calder said curtly. "Put it on my account." "Now, Mr. Shaw," Marla interjected. "We agreed." "We agreed you needed proper boots, unless you plan to walk barefoot come spring." She subsided, but he saw the way her jaw tightened. Pride. He recognized. Same kind that had made her walk 8 miles through a blizzard rather than beg for shelter. While she tried on boots, Calder became aware of a commotion near the fabric counter. Mrs. Hartley was holding court with several other women, their voices carrying despite efforts at discretion. From Kansas City, they say. You know what kind of women come from there. Bold as brass, moving right in. That poor child, exposed to God knows what influence. Evan had gone rigid beside him, his young face flushing with anger he didn't quite understand. Calder put a hand on his shoulder. Pay them no mind, he said quietly. But Marla had heard too. Her hands stilled on the bootlaces she was tying. For a moment, Calder saw something flash across her face. Not hurt exactly, more like weary recognition. Then she stood, testing the fit of the boots with deliberate calm. These will do nicely, she said. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. They finished their shopping in tense silence. At the counter, Morrison tallied their purchases with theatrical precision, as if expecting Calder to challenge every item. The total was fair, but the man's manner made the whole transaction feel dirty somehow. Outside, loading the wagon, Calder noticed Reverend Matthews approaching. The minister was one of the few men in town Calder still respected. Martha had thought highly of him, and he'd spoken well at her funeral. Calder, Matthews greeted. Good to see you in town. And you must be Mrs. Greaves. Welcome to Rosewood. His tone was genuinely warm. No undercurrent of judgment. Marla seemed to sense it too, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Thank you, Reverend. I hope you'll consider joining us for services. We're a small congregation, but sincere. That's kind of you. Matthews turned to Evan. How are you, young man, keeping up with your studies? Yes, sir, Mrs. Greaves is teaching me apostrophes. Excellent. Education is never wasted. He looked back at Calder. Martha would be glad to know the boy's learning continues. It was skillfully done, acknowledging Martha's memory while accepting the present situation. Calder felt a rush of gratitude for the man's tact. We should be getting back, Calder said. Of course. But Calder, Matthews lowered his voice. If anyone gives you trouble, either of you, my door is always open. The words anyone and trouble carried weight. Matthews knew what the town was saying, what they were thinking, and he was choosing sides. Quietly but clearly. They made one more stop, the dress goods shop where Marla needed thread. Calder waited outside with Evan and the wagon, but through the window he could see the shop girl's cold courtesy, the way other customers gave Marla wide berth. She emerged with her small purchase and climbed onto the wagon seat without comment. But as Calder guided the horses out of town, he felt her trembling beside him, not from cold, but from the effort of holding herself together under all those judging eyes. They don't know you, Evan said suddenly, fiercely. They don't know anything. No, Marla agreed softly. They don't. Then why do they act like they do? Because people are afraid of what they don't understand, she said. And it's easier to make up stories than to learn the truth. That's stupid. Yes, she said simply. It is. They rode in silence for a while, leaving the town and its whispers behind. As they passed the Turner farm again, Calder surprised himself by speaking. First time I came back from the war, people looked at me like that, like I might be dangerous. Like whatever I'd done, wherever I'd been, it might be catching. What did you do? Ignored them, worked my land, married Martha, let time prove what words couldn't. Did it work? Mostly. Some folks never change their minds once they've made them up. But most people, given time and evidence, will come around to truth. And if they don't, Calder glanced at her, then they don't. Can't live your life trying to convince people who'd rather believe lies. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Mrs. Morrison asked if I needed separate receipts. What did that mean? It was Evan who answered, with a child's blunt honesty. She thought Pa might not want people knowing he was buying you things, like it was shameful. Evan, Calder started. It's all right, Marla interrupted.
He should know how the world works. Better to see it clear than be surprised by it later. Is that why you've seen it clear? Evan asked. The world being mean? Something like that. The boy considered this. Then he reached over and patted her gloved hand, a gesture so unexpected that both adults startled. Well, I think you're nice, he announced. And you make better biscuits than Mrs. Turner, even though she wins the county fair every year. High praise indeed, Marla said, and Calder heard a suspicious thickness in her voice as they turned onto their own road, climbing toward home. Calder felt something shift. They'd faced the town together, its whispers, its judgment, its small cruelties. They'd come through it, not unscathed but intact. And Evan had chosen a side, not just accepting Marla's presence, but defending it. That meant something, maybe everything. Thank you, Marla said quietly as their cabin came into view. For the boots, for everything. You earned them. That's not what I'm thanking you for. He knew what she meant. For not leaving her to face those stairs alone. For treating her like she belonged on that wagon seat. For the simple dignity of paying for her boots without shame. No need for thanks, he said. We're household. Household stands together. It wasn't quite the right word, but it was closer than anything else he could think of. Not family, not yet, maybe not ever, but something worth defending against the Mrs. Morrisons and Mrs. Hartleys of the world. As they pulled up to the cabin, Marla climbed down and began unloading supplies without being asked. Evan helped, chattering about apostrophes and biscuits and the unfairness of people who judged without knowing. And Calder sat for a moment on the wagon seat, watching them work together, thinking about Martha and what she would make of all this. Give them time. He could almost hear her say, hearts change slower than minds, but they do change. He hoped she was right. For all their sakes, he hoped she was right. It happened while she was cleaning out Martha's room. 2 months had passed since Marla's arrival, and the house had slowly yielded to her careful attention. Windows that hadn't been washed in years now let in clear mountain light. Floors that had known only basic sweeping revealed wood grain under her patient scrubbing. Even the heavy silence had lifted somewhat, replaced by the sounds of ordinary life. Her humming, Evan's lessons, the comfortable clatter of daily routine. But Martha's room had remained untouched, its door closed like a seal on the past, until the morning Calder found Marla standing before it, dust rag in hand. Spring cleaning seems early this year, he said carefully. The whole house needs airing. No point leaving one room to molder. She paused. Unless you'd rather I didn't. He thought about it, really thought about it. The room had stood empty for 3 years, a shrine to absence. Martha wouldn't have wanted that. She'd been too practical to appreciate monuments made of dust and stillness. Go ahead, he said, and tried not to feel like he was betraying something sacred. He stayed away while she worked, finding reasons to be in the barn or the far pasture. But when he came in for the noon meal, he found her at the kitchen table, holding an envelope. I was cleaning out the drawer of the writing desk, she said without preamble. This was wedged behind it. I wouldn't have read it, but I saw Evan's name. She held out the letter. Martha's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable. Calder's hands weren't quite steady as he took it. I never knew she wrote to him, he said. Maybe she meant to give it to him later, when he was older. Calder stared at the envelope. For my dear boy, Evan written across it in pencil. The letter's already fading. Inside could be her last words to their son. Thoughts she'd wanted preserved. Love she'd tried to capture on paper before the fever took her. I can't, he said, setting it down. Not yet. Marla nodded, understanding without explanation. There's more, not letters, but things, in the wardrobe, tucked away. What kind of things? Baby clothes, a christening gown, some pressed flowers in a book of poems. She hesitated. And this. She produced another piece of paper,
This one covered in Martha's earlier, stronger handwriting. Not a letter, more like notes to herself, scattered thoughts connected by dashes and arrows. Calder read fragments aloud. E. Smiled today. Real smile, not gas. C. Home late but brought wildflowers. Must remember to tell C about the baby. His voice failed. The baby. He sat down heavily. She was with child, Marla asked gently. She thought she might be, that last month before the fever. She was waiting to be sure before telling me. He rubbed his face. I found out when the doctor, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. The fever took them both. I'm sorry. She would have been happy about it. She wanted more children. Said Evan needed brothers and sisters to teach him how to share. His laugh was hollow. Instead, he learned how to lose. Marla was quiet for a moment. Then, would you like me to put these things back? Pretend I never found them? No. The word came out stronger than he expected. No, it's time. Past time. Maybe. She gathered the items carefully. The letter to Evan, the fragment of notes, a small packet of other papers. What should I do with them? Keep the letter safe. When he's older, maybe when he's got children of his own, he can read what his mother wanted him to know. He touched the other papers. I need to think on these. That evening after supper, while Evan practiced his letters, Calder found himself drawn back to Martha's notes, reading them by lamplight. He could almost hear her voice, quick and bright, full of plans and observations. Must plant sweet peas by the kitchen window. E. Growing so fast. Need new boots come spring. C. Working too hard again, forgetting to eat. Remember to mend his good shirt before Sunday. Ordinary things, the stuff of daily life that seemed so small when you were living it but became precious when it was gone. He'd forgotten about the sweet peas, about the way she'd fuss over his eating habits, about the careful stitches she'd put in his Sunday shirt. Pa, Evan looked up from his slate. You all right? Fine, son, just thinking. About Ma. Calder glanced at Marla, who kept her eyes on her sewing. Yes. I think about her, too. Sometimes I forget things, though, like what her laugh sounded like. Like church bells, Calder said, but warmer. And she smelled nice, like lavender. She kept it in all the drawers. Hey, Mrs., Greaves found some today. Evan offered. In Ma's room. Said we could keep it if we wanted. Calder looked at Marla again. She'd changed from the woman who'd arrived half-frozen 2 months ago. The hollow cheeks had filled out. The wariness in her eyes had eased somewhat. But more than that, she'd found her place in their household rhythm, not trying to fill Martha's space, but carving out her own. That letter, he said abruptly. The one to Evan. What did you make of it? She set down her sewing. I didn't read it through, just saw it was addressed to him and stopped. But you saw some of it. The first line, my dear boy. If you're reading this. She paused. It seemed private, sacred. Even everything she touched seemed sacred after she died. Calder admitted. Her brush still had hair in it. Couldn't bring myself to clean it. Like I was keeping part of her trapped there. That's not foolish. It's love. It's both, he said. Foolish love. The kind that makes you hold on to hurt because it's all you've got left of someone. Evan had stopped writing, absorbing this adult conversation with the solemn attention he gave everything these days. Is that why you kept her room closed, to keep her there? Maybe, or maybe I was afraid of what I'd find, what I'd remember. What did you find? Calder thought of the baby clothes, the evidence of hopes that never had a chance to bloom. Proof that life goes on even when we think it shouldn't. Your mother was making plans right up until the end. She didn't know it was the end. That's good, isn't it? Evan asked. Better than knowing? I suppose it is. Marla rose, began clearing the table. I'll finish the room tomorrow if you'd like, or leave it be. Your choice. Finish it. Calder decided. But save anything that looks like it mattered. It all mattered, she said softly. That's what makes it hard. Later, after Evan had gone to bed, Calder found himself standing in the doorway of Martha's room. Marla had worked wonders already. The surfaces gleamed. The air smelled of soap and lemon oil instead of dust and memory. But traces remained: the wedding quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the silver brush set on the dresser, the small painting of Evan as a baby that Martha had commissioned from a traveling artist. She was beautiful, Marla said from behind him. She'd approached so quietly he hadn't heard her. He followed her gaze to the portrait on the wall. Martha on their wedding day, young and bright-eyed, wearing her mother's pearl collar. Inside and out, he agreed. You were lucky to have her. I know. They stood together in the doorway, not quite in the room, but no longer locked out of it either. I was with someone once, Marla said unexpectedly. Not my husband. Before him. A man who promised things he had no intention of delivering. When I finally understood that, I felt so foolish, like I should have known better. Calder waited, sensing more coming. But my mother told me something I've never forgotten. She said love is never foolish, even when it's misplaced. The foolishness is in the people who take advantage of it, not in the ones brave enough to offer it. Your mother sounds wise. She was like Martha? Marla turned to go, then paused. That letter to Evan, whatever's in it, he'll treasure it. Children need to know they were loved, especially by people who can't tell them anymore. After she'd retired to her corner, Calder remained in the doorway. The room looked different now. Not a shrine, but just a room. A room where a woman had slept and dressed and written letters to a son she wouldn't see grow up. A room where hopes had lived alongside the ordinary business of being human. Tomorrow he'd read the rest of Martha's notes. Maybe he'd find more surprises, more evidence of the life she'd been living while he'd been too busy to notice. But tonight, it was enough to stand here and remember without drowning in it. Through the kitchen, he could hear Marla settling for the night. She'd taken Martha's lavender sachets and hung them near her cot. He could smell the faint sweetness drifting through the house. It should have bothered him. That scent in a new place, associated with a new person, but somehow it didn't. Martha would have liked that, he thought. She'd always said lavender was meant to be used, not hoarded. What good is sweetness if you keep it locked away? She'd ask when he'd tease her about her liberal use of the herb. He closed the door to Martha's room, to the spare room now, and headed for bed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The town would continue to talk. The work would continue to demand. The careful dance of three people learning to live together would continue its complicated steps. But tonight, something had shifted. A door had opened, literally and figuratively. A letter waited to be read when the time was right. And somewhere in the kitchen, lavender scented the air around a woman who understood that some things were too precious to be buried with the dead. It wasn't betrayal, he realized. It was what Martha had written in those scattered notes. Life going on, making plans, finding sweetness where it could, even when you thought it shouldn't. Especially then. The storm hit just after midnight, violent and sudden as a cavalry charge. Lightning split the sky in jagged white veins, and thunder shook the cabin hard enough to rattle dishes on their shelves. Calder woke to the sound of horses screaming in the barn. He was pulling on his boots when Evan appeared at his door, hair wild with sleep and fear. Pa! Something's wrong with the horses. I hear them. Stay inside. But as he headed for the door, another sound cut through the storm, the sharp crack of splintering wood. Through the kitchen window, he saw it. The barn's roof had partially caved under the weight of wet snow and wind. Worse, in the flickering lightning, he could see the orange glow beginning inside. The lantern they kept hanging by the door must have fallen and broken. Fire! Marla was suddenly there, fully dressed as if she'd never gone to bed. The hay will catch fast in this wind. Calder grabbed his coat. Both of you stay here. Like hell.
Marla said, already reaching for her shawl. "You'll need hands to get the animals out." He didn't have time to argue. The orange glow was spreading, fed by dry hay and fanned by wind through the broken roof. 3 horses, 4 milk cows, and a dozen chickens were in that barn. More than that, all their feed for the winter, their tools, everything they couldn't afford to lose. "Evan, get the water buckets," he ordered. "Many as you can carry. Set them by the well." They ran into the storm together, rain turning to sleet that stung like needles. The horses were in full panic now, kicking at their stall doors. Smoke was beginning to pour from the gaps in the barn walls. "Get the cows first," Calder shouted over the wind. "They're in the far pen. Less smoke there yet." Marla didn't hesitate. While he fought to calm the horses enough to lead them out, she plunged into the darker end of the barn. He could hear her voice, steady and calm, talking to the terrified cattle as if they were children needing comfort. The first horse, their mare Bess, finally trusted him enough to follow. He led her to the corral, then ran back for the others. The smoke was thicker now, catching in his throat. Through the chaos, he saw Marla emerging with 2 cows, her slight frame somehow managing to guide the massive animals through the smoke. "Where's the dog?" Evan's voice cut through everything. The boy had appeared at the barn door, ignoring orders to stay clear. "Pa, where's Scout?" Calder's heart sank. The old sheepdog slept in the barn on cold nights, usually in the back corner near the chicken coop. That area was already consumed by smoke and creeping flame. "Get back to the house," he ordered, but Evan was already running toward the barn's far end. "Evan, no." But it was Marla who moved, dropping the cow's lead and sprinting after the boy. She caught him just as he reached the wall of smoke, wrapping her arms around him as he fought to get free. "He's in there, Scout's in there." "I know, sweetheart, I know." She looked back at Calder, and something passed between them, a wordless communication born of crisis. "Get the other horses. I'll find the dog." Marla. But she was already gone, plunging into the smoke with Evan's desperate cries behind her. Calder cursed and returned to the horses, leading them out one by one, his lungs burning with each trip. The roof beam groaned ominously above, threatening to collapse completely. Time stretched strange and elastic. He got the last horse clear, saw Evan by the water buckets, throwing pathetically small amounts at the growing inferno. Where was Marla? The smoke was so thick now he couldn't see past the doorway. Then a figure stumbling from the barn, something bundled in her arms. She emerged like a ghost from the black smoke, hair wild, face streaked with soot. In her arms, wrapped in what looked like her own petticoat, was Scout, singed but alive. She made it 3 steps before her knees buckled. Calder caught her before she hit the ground, the dog tumbling free and limping toward Evan. "Can't breathe," she gasped, coughing violently. He half carried, half dragged her away from the barn, getting her clear just as the main beam gave way with a sound like the world ending. The roof collapsed completely, sending a shower of sparks into the storm-dark sky. "Evan, the water!" Calder shouted, but he knew it was useless. The barn was gone. All they could do now was keep the fire from spreading to the house or woodshed. For the next hour, they fought, throwing bucket after bucket on the edges of the fire, beating back embers that flew toward other buildings. The rain helped, finally intensifying enough to slow the flames spread. By the time dawn broke gray and bitter, the barn was a smoking ruin, but everything else stood safe. They gathered in the kitchen, a sorry trio covered in soot and ash. Marla's hands were burned. Not badly, but enough to blister. She'd torn her petticoat to wrap the dog, and the hem of Martha's dress was charred black. Evan sat with Scout's head in his lap, tears making clean tracks through the dirt on his face. "I'm sorry," the boy kept saying. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have run in. I just couldn't let him—" "Hush," Calder said, more gently than he felt. Inside, his heart was still racing from the near miss of almost losing his son to flames. It's done now. We're all here and breathing. Your hands, he said to Marla. Let me see. She held them out reluctantly. The burns were mainly on her palms, from grabbing hot metal or wood. He guessed. Already blistering. They'd be painful for weeks. I've got salve, he said. Martha made it for burns. He fetched the jar from the shelf, remembered Martha smoothing this same mixture on his hands after he'd grabbed a too-hot pot handle. The familiar scent of comfrey and calendula filled the kitchen as he carefully applied it to Marla's burns. This was foolish, he said as he worked. Running into fire for a dog. Yes, she agreed simply. Could have killed you. Yes. Then why? She looked at Evan, who was still focused on Scout. Because that boy already lost his mother. Losing that dog would have broken something in him that might never mend. Some things are worth the risk. Calder finished wrapping her hands in clean cloth, his touch perhaps gentler than necessary. Thank you, he said quietly, for going after him. For acting like family, she finished. Because that's what we do. Isn't it family runs into burning buildings for each other, even when it's foolish, especially then. The word hung between them. Family. They'd been so careful to avoid it, to maintain the fiction that this was just a business arrangement. But somewhere between arriving half-frozen and running into flames, Marla had become more than hired help, and they all knew it. The barn, Evan said in a small voice. All the winter feed, the tools. What will we do? Calder surveyed the damage through the window. It was bad. Worse than bad. Without the barn, they'd have to build temporary shelters for the animals. Without the feed stores, they'd have to buy hay at winter prices. The tools could be replaced, but at costs they could barely afford. We'll manage, he said with more confidence than he felt. Always do. I have money saved, Marla offered. Not much, but... No. Calder's voice was firm. That's yours. We'll find another way. She started to argue, then stopped, recognizing the same pride in him that had made her walk 8 miles through a blizzard. Then we'll all work harder, she said. Make do with less. Stretch what we have. The neighbors might help with the barn raising, Evan suggested hopefully. When the miller's barn burned, everyone came to help rebuild. Calder doubted their neighbors would be as generous, given the gossip about Marla, but he didn't say that to his son. Maybe so. First things first. We need to get the animals settled somewhere for today. They worked through the morning, exhaustion forgotten in the face of necessity. The woodshed became a temporary chicken coop. They strung canvas between trees to create rough shelters for the horses and cows. Everything smelled of smoke and char. But the animals were alive, and that was what mattered. It was afternoon before they finally stopped, too tired to continue. Marla somehow managed to prepare a simple meal despite her bandaged hands. They ate in silence, the weight of the night's events settling over them like ash. I keep thinking, Evan said suddenly, what Ma would say about the barn. What do you think she'd say? Calder asked. She'd say at least it wasn't the house, and that things can be rebuilt but people can't be replaced. The boy paused. And then she'd probably start planning where to put the new barn better than before. Despite everything, Calder smiled. That sounds like her. She was good at finding the silver lining, Marla observed, even when the whole sky was dark. You would have liked her, Evan told Marla, and she would have liked you. Why do you think that? Because you ran into a fire for our dog. Ma always said you could judge people by how they treated animals when nobody was watching. He yawned hugely. Also, you make good biscuits. The simple childhood logic broke the tension. Even Calder found himself chuckling, a rusty sound, but genuine. Go rest, he told his son. We'll have more work tomorrow. After Evan climbed to his loft, Scout limping faithfully behind, Calder and Marla sat at the table, both too tired to move. It's a disaster, he said finally.
Yes, we might not make it through winter without that barn and feed. Maybe not. You could find work elsewhere, somewhere with a barn that's not a pile of ash. She looked at him steadily. Is that what you want for me to go? He thought about it, really thought about it. Life would be simpler without her. No town gossip, no disruption to their routine, no complicated feelings stirring in his chest when she smiled at his son or hummed while she worked. But he also thought about Evan's face when she'd emerged from the smoke with Scout, about the quiet ways she'd transformed their house back into a home, about the words she'd used, family, and how right it had sounded despite all his resistance. No, he said, that's not what I want. She nodded, satisfied. Then we'd better start planning where to put the new barn. Better than before, like Martha would have done. Outside, the ruins of the old barn still smoldered, sending up occasional wisps of smoke. But inside the kitchen, 3 people who'd been strangers just months before sat together, planning for a future that suddenly seemed worth the building. Calder looked at Marla's bandaged hands and thought about sacrifices made without calculation, about love offered without expectation of return. Maybe that's what family really was. Not blood or vows or careful agreements, but the willingness to run into flames for each other. The storm had passed, leaving destruction in its wake. But sometimes, Calder reflected, things needed to burn down before they could be rebuilt stronger. And sometimes, it took a disaster to show you what and who truly mattered. The morning after the fire, Reverend Matthews arrived before the coffee had finished brewing. His wagon carried lumber scraps and a promise of more to come. Heard about your trouble, he said simply, surveying the still smoking ruins. The church has some materials set aside for emergencies. It's yours if you'll have it. Calder's throat tightened. After months of cold shoulders and whispered judgments from the town, this simple kindness hit harder than expected. That's generous, Reverend, but I can't take charity. It's not charity, it's community. Matthew's eyes were kind but firm. Martha understood that. She was always first to help when others were in need. Time we returned the favor. By noon, 2 more wagons had arrived. The Hutchinson brothers with salvaged barn boards. Old Samuel Green with a load of hay he claimed was extra, though everyone knew he'd need it come February. They worked without fuss, clearing debris and sorting what could be saved. But it was the 4th wagon that surprised everyone. Tom Harrison, the tax assessor who'd spread the news about Marla far and wide, pulled up with his assistant and a load of new nails. Calder, he said awkwardly. Heard you had some trouble. The 2 men regarded each other warily. Harrison's visit weeks ago had started the worst of the gossip. Now here he was, hat literally in hand. Fire took the barn, Calder said evenly. I see that. Also heard Mrs. Greaves ran into it. Saved your boy's dog. Harrison shifted his weight. That took courage. It did. Harrison glanced toward the house where Marla was visible through the window, her bandaged hands carefully managing the coffee pot. I may have misjudged the situation here. My wife says I'm quick to think the worst of folks. Says it comes from seeing too many tax dodgers and liars in my line of work. And maybe she's right. A woman who'd risk burning for a child's dog, well, that says something about character, doesn't it? It wasn't an apology exactly, but in the complicated language of frontier pride, it was close enough. Calder nodded once, accepting what was offered. We could use the help, he admitted. Then you'll have it. By evening, the skeleton of a new barn was rising from the ashes of the old. Nothing fancy frontier construction was about function, not form, but it would shelter animals and hay. And that was what mattered. Marla moved among the workers with coffee and what food they could spare, her bandaged hands making the service clumsy but no less appreciated. Calder noticed how the men's attitudes shifted throughout the day. Where morning had brought careful distance and averted eyes, by afternoon there were nods of thanks, even a few direct conversations. It was young Will Hutchinson who broke the last barrier, barely 17 and not yet versed in adult prejudices. He approached Marla directly as she refilled his cup. "Ma'am, my mother wanted me to ask. That is, she's wondering if you might know anything about teaching letters. My sister Lucy, she's struggling something fierce. And Ma heard you'd been helping the Shaw boy." Marla glanced at Calder before answering. "I'd be happy to help if I can. Perhaps she could come by after church on Sundays." That'd be real fine, ma'am. I'll tell Ma." And just like that, the ice cracked. If the respectable Hutchinson family was willing to send their daughter for lessons, others might follow. Calder saw Marla understand this too, saw her shoulders straighten just a little under the weight of possibility. As the sun set, the workers began to disperse. The barn walls stood head high now, ready for roofing come tomorrow. It wasn't complete, but it was a start, more than Calder had dared hope for that morning. Reverend Matthews was last to leave. At his wagon, he paused. "Calder, a word." They walked a little away from the house, the Reverend choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about your situation here. You, the boy, Mrs. Greaves. It's unconventional." "That it is." "But then, so was Ruth, gleaning in Boaz's fields. So was the Good Samaritan stopping for a stranger. Sometimes God works through unconventional means." "What are you saying, Reverend?" Matthews smiled. "I'm saying that if two people wanted to make an unconventional situation more conventional, I'd be honored to perform the service. Something simple. Quiet, if you prefer." Calder's chest tightened. "Reverend." "Just think on it," Matthews interrupted gently. "No rush. But Calder, that woman ran into fire for your boy, and you've been looking at her all day like she hung the moon. Maybe it's time to stop pretending this is just about housekeeping." After Matthews left, Calder stood in the gathering dusk, his mind churning. Through the kitchen window, he could see Marla and Evan at the table, heads bent together over his slate. She was teaching him to write with his left hand while her right was still too bandaged to hold a pencil properly. The boy was laughing at something she'd said, the sound bright as bells in the evening air. He thought of Martha, of their quiet wedding in this same yard nearly 10 years ago. She'd worn her mother's dress and flowers from the meadow in her hair. "Promise me," she'd said that night, "that if something happens, you won't stop living. Promise me you'll find happiness again." He'd promised, thinking it was just wedding night talk, the kind of thing people said when they couldn't imagine ever being apart. But Martha had known better. She'd always been wiser about the heart than he was. Inside now, he found them still at lessons. Marla looked up as he entered, and something in her face made his decision for him. "Evan," he said, "go check on Scout. Make sure he's settled for the night." The boy went, recognizing the tone that meant adults needed to talk. When they were alone, Calder sat across from Marla, trying to find words for what needed saying. "Today changed things," he began. "The town, they're starting to see you different. Because I saved a dog. Because you showed them who you are. Not the story they made up, but the truth of you." She was quiet, waiting. Her bandaged hands rested on the table between them like a reminder of all she'd already sacrificed for this makeshift family. Reverend Matthews said something before he left, about making things more conventional. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Calder, hear me out." He took a breath. "I'm not a man of pretty words, never have been. But I know what I see. I see how Evan lights up when you're teaching him. I see how this house feels alive again instead of just inhabited. I see how you fit here, like you were meant to find us." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that what we have, it's already more than arrangement, more than convenience. Maybe it's time we called it what it is." "And what is it?" He reached across the table, carefully taking her bandaged hands in his. "It's a life, a future, a family, if you'll have us. Not perfect, not without ghosts, but real." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I'm not Martha.
I can't be her. I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to be Marla. To be yourself, here, with us. To let us be yours like you've become ours. The town saw you run into fire for us. They'll see the rest in time, and if they don't, that's their loss. She was crying now, quiet tears that seemed to come from some deep well of emotion. I came here with nothing, less than nothing, just debt and desperation and a past I can't entirely escape. We all have pasts. It's the future that matters now. Is this a proposal? Calder Shaw. It's a recognition, he said, of what's already true, of what's been building since you stood by that stove and declared yourself ours. I'm just slow to see things sometimes. Martha always said I was stubborn that way. She sounds wise. She was wise enough to make me promise I'd find happiness again if she couldn't stay. He squeezed her hands gently, mindful of the burns. I think maybe I've been trying to keep that promise without realizing it. Evan appeared in the doorway, Scout at his heels. Is everything all right? Come here, son, Calder said. The boy approached cautiously, reading the serious mood. How would you feel? Calder asked carefully. About making Mrs. Greaves a proper part of our family. Not just as housekeeper, but permanent-like. Evan's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like relief. You mean she'd stay always? If she's willing. The boy turned to Marla. Would you stay always? If you'll have me, she said softly. We already picked you, Evan said with a child's simple certainty. When you saved Scout, when you taught me apostrophes, when you made Pa smile again, we picked you lots of times. And that, Calder thought, was the truth of it. Not one grand gesture, but 1,000 small choices, each one building on the last until what they'd built was stronger than any of them alone. Then it settled, he said. Reverend Matthews offered to perform a service. Something simple. When your hands are healed, if you're willing. Marla looked between them, man and boy, weathered by loss but not broken by it. I'm willing, she said. More than willing. Evan whooped and hugged her, careful of her bandages. Even Scout barked, caught up in the joy of the moment, and Calder sat back, watching his family, yes, family, celebrate this new beginning built on the ashes of the old. Outside, the skeleton of the new barn stood dark against the stars. Tomorrow they'd raise the roof, make it weather-tight before the next storm. But tonight, the only shelter that mattered was this kitchen, these people, this choice to build something together despite all the reasons not to. We should tell the Reverend, Marla said, practical even through her tears. Tomorrow, Calder said. Tonight, let's just be. And they were just 3 people around a table, planning a future that had seemed impossible that morning. The fire had taken their barn but given them clarity. Sometimes, Calder reflected, you had to lose what you thought you needed to find what you truly couldn't live without. Martha would have loved this, he thought, would have loved Marla's courage, Evan's joy, even his own stumbling journey toward happiness. Promise me, she'd said, and finally, he was keeping that promise. The old life was ash and char, but the new one was already taking shape, board by board, choice by choice, into something worth having, something worth keeping, something worth calling home. 50 years later, Sarah McKenna sat in her grandmother's kitchen, reading through the worn diaries she'd discovered in the attic. The house had changed over the decades. Electricity now, running water, a proper stove instead of the old wood burner. But the bones were the same, the thick logs her grandfather Calder had cut and shaped with his own hands. Found something interesting, her father asked, coming in from the barn. Evan Shaw was near 70 now, his sandy hair gone silver, but still spry enough to work the ranch that had grown from his father's small homestead. Grandma Marla's diary, Sarah said, holding up the leather-bound book. From her first years here.
Evan's weathered face softened. Haven't seen that in years. She used to write in it every evening after supper. Said it helped her make sense of things. Sarah had reached the final entry, dated spring 1902. The handwriting was still clear, though the ink had faded to brown. 27 years I've lived in this house. 27 years since I arrived, half dead at Calder's door, with nothing but desperation and a canvas bag. Sometimes I marvel at the journey, how a woman with no prospects became wife, mother, grandmother, how a house that echoed with grief became filled with laughter again. Calder's hands shake now when he holds his coffee cup. The doctor says his heart is tired, which makes me smile despite everything. That heart worked so hard for so long, carrying grief and joy in equal measure. He told me yesterday he has no regrets. You woke us up, he said. Evan and me both. We were sleeping through life until you came. But the truth is, we woke each other. Evan brought his Alice home last month with news of their first child. The continuity of it takes my breath away, life insisting on itself, generation after generation. This house will hear new cries soon, see new first steps, shelter new dreams. I think of Martha sometimes. Wonder if she knows how well I've kept her boys. Her portrait still hangs in the parlor, and I tell her thank you when I pass. Thank you for the husband who learned to love again. Thank you for the son who calls me Ma without forgetting his first mother. Thank you for the life I never expected to have. The preacher says we'll meet in the hereafter, all of us together with our complicated loves sorted out clear. I hope that's true. I have much to tell her. But for now, there is bread to bake and sheets to mend and a husband who still looks at me like I hung the moon. Even after all these years, there is a son grown strong and kind, and soon a grandchild to spoil. There is this house, these mountains, this life built from ashes and determination, and the wild hope that broken things can be made whole. If I sleep here, I wake yours. I told him that first night, not knowing what I was promising. Now I know. I was promising to see them clear, to love them true, to stay when staying was hard and leaving would have been easier. I was promising to be family in all its messy, painful, glorious complexity. It was the best promise I ever made. The sun is setting now, painting the mountains gold. Calder is calling from the porch, wondering where I've gotten to. Time to close this book and go to him. Time to be present in this moment we've made, this life we've built, this love that grew slowly, like trees in hard soil, but grew deep and strong and lasting. Not the end, just the turning of another page. Sarah wiped her eyes, moved beyond words by this woman she'd barely known as a child. She loved you all so much. That she did. Evan agreed. And we loved her. Not instead of my first mother, but alongside her. Marla taught me that hearts don't have limited space. They expand to hold whoever needs holding. How long were they married? 24 years. Pa went first, like she predicted. Went peaceful in his sleep with her holding his hand. She followed 3 years later. Said she'd waited long enough to see me settled and happy. Evan smiled. Stubborn to the end. Both of them. Dad, Sarah asked. That first line she quotes, "If I sleep here, I wake yours." What did that mean? Evan was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the mountains his parents had loved. I think it meant belonging, not possession, not ownership in the usual way, but belonging to each other, being responsible for each other's happiness. She slept in our house but woke up as family, and we woke up too, from grief, from just surviving day to day. We woke up to being alive again. It's beautiful. It was hard won. Don't let the pretty words fool you. There were difficult days, times when the past caught up, when the town's judgment weighed heavy, when they missed the people they'd lost. But they kept choosing each other, every day. That's what made it beautiful. Sarah closed the diary carefully, already planning to have it properly preserved. This story needed keeping, needed sharing with the children and grandchildren yet to come. Outside, The ghost of the old barn still marked the ground if you knew where to look, a slightly different color to the grass where fire had marked the earth. But beside it stood the barn that neighbors had helped raise, expanded now and solid as the mountains themselves. The fire had destroyed so much that night, but from those ashes had risen something stronger. Not just buildings, but bonds. Not just survival, but true living. A woman who'd arrived with nothing had given them everything. A man frozen in grief had learned to love again. A boy had gained a mother without losing the memory of his first. And it all started with a knock on a door in a blizzard, with kindness offered to a stranger, with a promise as simple and complex as family itself. If I sleep here, I wake yours. Sarah stood, placing the diary carefully on the shelf where it belonged. Someday she'd tell her own children this story, about the grandmother who'd walked through fire for them before they were even dreamed of, about the grandfather who'd chosen love over ease, about the way families are made not just from blood, but from choice, from staying, from the daily decision to belong to each other. The sun was setting now, painting the mountains the same gold Marla had described, and Sarah could almost hear them. All the voices of all the lives that had been lived in this house. Martha singing lullabies, Calder's rare laughter, young Evan practicing his letters, and Marla humming as she worked. The sound of a woman who had found her home at last. This was her inheritance. Sarah realized, not just land and buildings, but this legacy of resilience, of love persisting despite loss, of strangers becoming family through nothing more miraculous than showing up for each other, day after day, year after year. If I sleep here, I wake yours. The words echoed through time, a promise kept and renewed with each generation. And Sarah knew that someday, when she had children of her own, she would tell them this story. She would teach them that families are built from courage and kindness, that love multiplies rather than divides, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst disasters. But most of all, she would teach them what Marla Greaves Shaw had proved with her life, that belonging is both a gift and a choice, and that choosing to stay, to love, to build something lasting from the ashes of what came before, that's the greatest courage of all. The mountains stood eternal, keeping their secrets, but this one secret, this one beautiful truth, would be passed down like the precious thing it was, a story of strangers who became family, a testament to the power of simply showing up, a reminder that sometimes the very thing we think will destroy us becomes the foundation for something better than we ever dared imagine. In the old kitchen where it all began, evening settled like a benediction, and somewhere in the walls, in the very wood itself, lived the echo of a promise. If I sleep here, I wake yours. It was kept then, it was kept still, it would be kept always. And that, Sarah thought as she turned out the lights, was how love really worked, not in grand gestures, but in daily choices, not in perfection, but in persistence, not in forgetting what was lost, but in building something new while honoring what came before. The Shaw family story would continue, carried forward by new voices, new dreams, but it would always circle back to this: a cold night, a desperate woman, a grieving man, a lonely boy, and the wild, impossible hope that strangers could become family, that broken hearts could heal, that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. It had, it did, it would again. The rest, as they say, was history. But what a history it was. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed this journey through the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit the hype button to help more people discover these heartfelt stories of love, loss, and redemption in the American frontier.